Wonderful. Yes, and welcome to those online. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people and that we meet on traditional lands here at Parliament House, but also across New South Wales. It's the New South Wales Parliament, so all the lands across New South Wales. This Parliament hasn't always been fabulous as it relates to the laws that have been passed over the years, been deeply discriminatory, but we're getting better, right? The recent legislation on the Languages Act, for example, is making a really big difference in Aboriginal communities, bringing back language. Things are getting better. We in the administration have some fabulous Aboriginal staff in the Aboriginal liaison space who are helping guide us to do better engagement through our committees process with Aboriginal communities. So things are getting better, I'm hopeful, but really important acknowledgement. My name is Julie Langsworth, as Jeannie said. I am here today as acting Chief Executive of the Department of Parliamentary Services, but in my wonderful usual job, I work with this fabulous comms education and engagement team who are bringing this event to us this evening. So I'm very lucky. I've got two great jobs. Tonight it is my pleasure to officially open Behind the Lines, a night with the artists. That'd be you. It is. I hope you really enjoyed visiting the chambers, and then, as Jeannie said, you'll get to go and have a little look at the Behind the Lines exhibition. Thank you to Alex Walton and the team at MoAD for helping to make the exhibition and tonight's event possible. Really, we couldn't do it. This is our second outing, I think, and it's really fabulous. It's fabulous to have it back. Look, as you know, Behind the Lines is a travelling exhibition developed by the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House, which celebrates the role of political cartoonists and highlights the power that their drawings have in contributing to our daily political and social discourse. It is supported by the National Collecting Institutions Touring and Outreach Program, an Australian government program aiming to improve access to the National Collection for all Australians. We are very excited that the exhibition has toured here to New South Wales Parliament, and Fiona, I believe you might have had a little pre-display through Insiders a couple of weeks ago, one of my favourite shows. It was lovely to see you out there in the foyer with the exhibition behind you, displaying comics, so that was terrific. Look, Australia has a most fabulous history in political cartoons. I'm of a particular age. Who doesn't have their favourite cartoon in their office, in the back of the door, on their fridge? I happen to have one of my favourites here, so hopefully I might get it signed later on, Cathy. But who doesn't, right? It really is such a significant part of our deep culture. It's certainly my favourite part of opening up the Herald, reading all those words, and then bam, you hit that comic on that page near the letters, and it just sums everything up. Why did I read all those words? I should have just gone straight to that cartoon. It is a genius, an absolute genius art, and this evening we're going to get that opportunity to hear from the artists themselves about how they make the choices about creating that cartoon, as well as from the curator, hearing a little bit about the exhibition and how that comes together, and how you go about selecting those artists. So you want me off the stage, so I'm going to very quickly just introduce the panellists so we can get on with the show. Fiona Katauskas is a Sydney-sider who has been a cartoonist since 1997 and works, if you want to correct your bio, go for it, for The Guardian. Fine. Her work has also appeared in a wide range of publications, including the Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, The Age, New Matilda and Eureka Street. She is the author and illustrator of The Amazing True Story of How Babies Are Made, in 2015, and the author and illustrator of a new kids' book to be published in August titled Hi from Outer Space. Fantastic. Cathy Wilcox is a Sydney-based cartoonist and illustrator who's been drawing cartoons since 1989, it says here. Cathy's work appears almost daily in the Sydney Morning Herald, one of my favourites, and also in Melbourne's Age. She is the president of the Australian Cartoonists Association. Cathy is also award-winning illustrator of children's books and has received numerous Stanley, Walkley and Kennedy Awards. And Cathy was MoAD's Political Cartoonist of the Year in 2009, 2016 and 2020. And wonderful Jess Harwood, lovely to have you here, is an artist and campaigner living in Gadigal land in Sydney. She's published cartoons with The Guardian, and her work has been featured by the ABC, the BBC, and by social movements, charities and businesses. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Now, Jeannie's already mentioned the CE team. We've thanked them. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to introduce you and hand you over to Alex Walton from the Museum of Australian Democracy, who will host our panel of artists. Alex is an interpretation coordinator at MoAD and the curator of the Behind the Lines exhibition, All Fun and Games. Prior to joining MoAD in 2023, Alex worked as a curator at the Imperial War Museum in London. Oh, wow, that's really interesting, where she curated historical and art exhibitions. Perhaps you'll tell us a bit about that. Previously, Alex worked at the Australian War Memorial and National Gallery of Australia. Thank you so much for allowing me to give that introduction, and over to you, Alex.
Is that on? Yes. Thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction. And also thank you to New South Wales Parliament for hosting Behind the Lines, All Fun and Games, which is all about the year in political cartoons from 2023. I think it's looking beautiful out there in that space, and it's such a privilege to be in this beautiful building, Australia's first Parliament House, speaking to three of our eminent women political cartoonists in Australia. Thanks everyone for joining me on this panel. I found out something very interesting just before you arrived, Cathy, that both Jess and Fiona have actually worked in this building in a previous lifetime. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Fiona? Yeah, I think they're already on.
I think it's on now. Yeah. Yes, about 22 years ago I did, it's not very glamorous, I just did some admin work for Meredith Bergman, the legendary Meredith Bergman, so I was just helping answering letters from crazed constituents. You know, the people do really write 6-page letters in copperplate in green pen. It's real. So anyway, yeah, that's my contribution to New South Wales Parliament.
And I worked for John Kay, who many of you might remember, very, very passionate about public education, and also doing interesting admin work and responding to lots of letters.
Amazing.
I worked at David Jones.
Angry letters? Did you get angry letters?
Men's hats and overcoats. I can size your trouser size, your shoulder size, and your head size at a glance.
That's a minor superpower, I think. Yeah. Well, I find that really interesting because, of course, political cartooning is so important for our democratic system here in Australia. So you both had a bit of a foray into actually working in a parliament, and now you work in political cartoons. It's a really unusual career to actually choose for yourself. Can you each tell me a bit about how you actually got into the field? Maybe starting with you, Cathy. That's okay.
Because I've been in it for a longer time. So, it sort of evolved out of by a process, I suppose, of eliminating the things that I didn't enjoy doing and pursuing the things that I did enjoy doing. And broadly speaking, I enjoyed drawing, obvious, and I enjoyed words and language and humour and psychology and English and, you know, all of these things, and journalism and newspapers and all the rest of it. And after sort of making a basic decision at the end of school when I had to fill in one of those forms to decide what I might go and study, I just sort of had that dawning moment, and I fortunately for me, I suppose, third in the set and completely under the radar of my parents, out from under the radar of my parents, who thought that I would probably marry nicely and be kept in the manner to which I was accustomed. That anything I might want to go and do besides would just be a nice hobby for a nice gal. But yes, without their having a handle on it, I just kind of went, well, actually, you know, if there's some way I can do art, but do art that's not where I'm not just going to be doing paintings. I didn't feel like I had paintings in me, but I felt like I had drawings and stories and things like that. So an art degree that was called Visual Communications still exists these days at UTS. In those days, Sydney College of the Arts. Where ultimately my projects always ended up being in some way word and picture related. And then I better sort of tighten it up, but basically it was a sort of a combination between those interests and then also being very drawn to the newspaper, not exactly knowing what form my contribution to the newspaper would be, except that I was always looking at the drawings and the illustrations in the paper, and I loved the fact that the subject matter changed all the time. And I thought that's a thing I could do, because I didn't want to be kind of stuck on the one topic or stuck in the one job or stuck in any manner. Wedded to something that I found boring. Oh, I also had a thing where, post art college job beyond David Jones, this was, doing some graphic design and realising that there were things that just utterly bored me, and if I got bored I just would doze off. And so that also made it really easy to go, well, I'll just do the things that I don't doze off at, and that should work. So anyway, that's how I kind of came to trying to get drawings in publications, and eventually I won't go through the whole long process, but eventually coming to the Herald with a portfolio of drawings and being given a few spots in an incredibly privileged time for newcomers. 35 years ago, you could come in with a portfolio but also not really a name, and they'd say, oh well, you can go and see the so and so editor, and you can fill the spaces that they have to fill, and so you got to try your stuff out, see it printed the next day, see what was wrong with it and what was right with it, and hone your skill, and then that led to another more regular job there, and on it has gone from there.
Nice to know. And Fiona, did you have a similar experience?
No, I had. I didn't know. I became a cartoonist accidentally. People say, "How did you become a cartoonist?" My first response is accidentally. I didn't ever think of myself as arty, and I'm still not a good drawer. But I was always very into political, like social justicey kind of stuff. And I studied politics at ANU, and then was really focused on working in overseas aid and human rights, and did some internships overseas and did stuff. And finally, after a long time, I got an entry-level job I was living in Melbourne at International Women's Development Agency, which is a great NGO, still exists, it's wonderful. Then after a year, in the build-up to this, I'd been volunteering, working as a waitress at night and volunteering at aid organisations full-time in the day to try and get my foot in the door, which is a really bad way to do it, because everyone goes, why would we give you a job when you work for us for free? But during that, so I did that, then finally got a job, and then after a year I was made redundant, and this was in 1997. The whole NGO industry was just slammed by job cuts. And I sort of thought, I've been trying to do this for 5 years, and finally got my foot in the door. Anyway, and I had no idea what I was going to do. I was redundant, and I was whinging to one of my very old friends, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to plan for. It's my whole life's aim. And he said, why don't you become a cartoonist? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, you do it all the time. He said, you do it. I did obsess. When friends had birthdays, I do. He said, everyone's kept all your cards, and, when I was volunteering for NGOs and stuff, if there was any sort of campaign, I'd go, oh, I'll draw something for that, and I'd produce, and I didn't even think, I just did it. And I had at this stage, there was lots of work in newspapers, so there was lots of freelance work and things like that. So anyway, I thought, and he just kept hassling me. I was like, oh, Andrew, as if this is going to work, all right. And then I sent some stuff off to The Age and some stuff off to the Sydney Morning Herald, and I had no idea what I was doing. I photocopied things, and then I made this little black book. And anyway, it's embarrassing to think about it now. But then I was about to say, and that day I heard nothing, called The Age art director, and I said, oh, hi, I've sent in some stuff. And she said, look, can I just be frank with you? Look, your stuff's no good, you're not going to make it. And I wasn't that upset. I was like, yeah, well, told you, Andrew. I gave it a go and it didn't work. And then just as I was heading off to my waitressing job on that same night, I got a call from David Dale at the Sydney Morning Herald saying, hi, look, I just got your portfolio. Our cartoonist for tomorrow is pulled out. Can I use one of these? And I went, yeah, you're totally fine. And then I walked up. I still remember so clearly walking to my waitressing job that night. My heart was just thumping and I was going, did I just become a cartoonist? And I had not, like, this was back in the faxing days and, So then I was really lucky that then I started to get little bits and pieces of work. I got quite a lot of work for the Sydney Morning Herald straight off, because also there were 3 other freelance, Andrew Weldon, Phil Somerville and I. They'd get a call, the Drive section wants a cartoon, or a restaurant review, and there were staff and 3 freelancers doing this. It was like a wonderful time and like Cathy said, you got to hone your craft because you got opportunities and working to deadlines and stuff. And so and then I got no work for ages and ages, and like it's my work, like, and I came in as the industry started dying, so it's been, and you got paid less and less and less as well, so you get paid now a lot less than you would have got paid for the same thing in actual straight dollar terms, not even real terms, or real and whatever. But yeah, so I was lucky that gave me, like, just going, oh, maybe I can do this, and I didn't know anyone in the media. I had to sort of muddle my way through it, and so yeah, that's the long and short in there. So I've had lots of periods where there hasn't been much work, and lots of periods where there have. But yeah, I'm super fortunate at the moment. So yes.
Yes. So, Cathy and Fiona, you're both working, regularly full-time for a paper, and Jess, you have a really different way of going about getting your cartoons out there. And tell us about your origin story for coming to political cartooning. And I know you do other types of graphic things as well, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will. Actually, Behind the Lines, like, I've always wanted to be a political cartoonist, and Behind the Lines was kind of the moment. My parents, who are sitting down there, hi Mum and Dad, they brought me to a Behind the Lines exhibition when I was in high school, and it was like the Howard years, Chasers War and everything was on TV. I think I had a crush on every single one of the Chaser guys, and I kind of thought,
too.
Yeah, still do.
Still
Sorry,
do.
Matt. Yeah. And, I was a politically nerdy kid who could draw, and I thought, oh my God, you can do this? Like, that's amazing. And then I went through a little journey through becoming a lawyer and working at a garbage truck company and doing all sorts of other things. But it was really, and I actually hate this story a bit because I have to thank Scott Morrison for making me a cartoonist. I know. Scott Morrison became my muse, and I don't want you to think of Scott Morrison reclining on a chaise lounge with like velvet drapes behind him and cherubs. It
Totally
wasn't like
of it
that.
way.
No, we're all thinking that.
Yeah. But it was more like it was the bushfires. We were stuck inside, or I was stuck inside. I'm quite passionate about climate campaigning and climate change. And when he went off to Hawaii, and we were inside, and I thought, what can I do? And so I just drew a cartoon and I put it up on the internet, and it went totally viral. And I kind of went, oh, okay, there is actually an audience for this. That's amazing. And then I just kept doing more and more. And then, of course, we got stuck in lockdown, and I can't bake sourdough, so I just drew cartoons. And I sort of like started just kind of building a community online, and people started following me, and I was just putting them on Instagram and Twitter and like Facebook. And I realised that there was actually an audience out there for what I was doing, so I just kind of kept doing it. And eventually The Guardian reached out to me and said, would you like to do some stuff for us? And I was like, yeah, I would. So that was kind of my trajectory into it. It's not a full-time job for me. I kind of do it when I can. But I do some campaign work as well, like you, Fiona, doing NGO kind of cartoons, explainer cartoons, infotoons, graphic design posters, those sort of things to keep me going as well.
Can you tell me a bit about how you actually make your cartoons? Like, what materials do you use, or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I used to draw and scan them in and do it that way, but now I just use an iPad, and there's an amazing piece of software called Procreate, which is actually free, and it's great. Is it Australian? I didn't know that.
It's a Tasmanian
Wow.
person invented it, and it's very good.
That's great. If you're interested in trying it, it's so much fun. You can basically get all the different inks and pens and everything. But I love it because it's so... it makes the colours really bright. It makes it really quick. I'm often doing cartoons really quickly after work in my free time, so I don't want it to take a long time. So I just do it, export it, and it's really easy. And a lot of fun that way.
Nice. And Fiona, you have a really different technique, don't you?
Yeah, I'm extremely old school. I draw, and I've tried tablets. They're fast. It doesn't. I have a great passion for nib pens dipped in ink, the really old-fashioned ones. Yeah, so my process is a bit of watercolour paper, 300 GSM, little slightly rough texture. Draw it in pencil. Then I do the ink work in one of those dipped in a pot of ink, the old nib pens. And, they are so very heaven. I've just got the feel of one of those iPad pens on it, the surface is not like, just the grip of the, and the wet ink. It's just, I could never give that up. Anyway, so draw that. And one of my most important tools of my trade is my hairdryer. So then I've got to blast it with a hairdryer to dry the ink, because otherwise it would take forever to dry. Then I rub out the pencil, and then I paint in watercolours and gouache, and then dry each thing as I go. So when I first became a cartoonist years and years ago, and I had a housemate, and I moved in, and after a while he said to me, "Can I just ask you something? I always hear your hairdryer going, but your hair looks the same." And I'm a messy person. I've just got hair. I'm not fan. My hair just grows out of my head, and so I could just totally get it, because it's like you're just a sort of grot, a messy grot. But what the hell are you doing? And I just go, "Oh right, sorry. I guess that probably was weird." Anyway, yeah. And then the hairdryer is an absolutely essential part of my work. Then I scan it in, and then quite often, because it's messy, and I also work really fast and a bit carelessly, get ink blobs, or sometimes I'll think of slightly different wording, and so I do a little bit of post in Photoshop, but I'm super bad at that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Has your technique developed over the years, Cathy?
Well, I used to do the same as Fiona there, with the beautiful 300 GSM paper with a bit of a tooth, and search the world for the right nibs, and search the world. Yes, the conversations of cartoonists. So, what's the ink you're using, and what and do you have to do all your colour work first before you do the pen line, because it's so hard to find an ink that doesn't run when you put on wet medium and so forth, and all that sort of stuff, and I would not, even since having children, I would not wear white clothes, because there would be a likelihood that I would end up with ink or colour or paint on me or whatever. And then my daughter, who is a tech advanced sort of a person, whereas I'm a slow to adopt type of a person, she thrust this iPad under me one day with with Procreate or whatever the program was that preceded that paper, I think, and just sort of said, have a go at this. What do you have a little play? And I went, ooh, this is kind of good. This is fun. And then, but I was always still attached to doing the pen and ink stuff, and I wasn't sort of sure. And that feeling of the stylus or the Apple Pencil or whatever on the glass is a very different feel to the nib on paper and stuff. But then a few things. A few opportunities came up, and one was going to a conference overseas where I was required to draw cartoons sort of while the things were going on, the panel discussions were going on. And I was meant to be able to draw these cartoons quickly if possible, and so that the organisers, it was a UNESCO sort of organisation that had invited me, and they were then meant to be able to distribute these cartoons online and so it suddenly made a whole lot more sense, rather than drawing something on paper, finding a way to scan it, finding it, doing all that. If I did it on the iPad, I could send it directly. They could have it. They could put it on social media and so forth. It was a press freedom conference, and so the drawing stuff was, and the material was really interesting to me, and I just accepted not to be precious about the style. I just kind of went, okay, the main thing is what I'm saying. So the style was actually rough and ready, and that, as I say, it was an older program. Then I've since got to know Procreate, which is much more refined. It's sort of like the difference between a fat crayon on butcher's paper and a fine, and a whole sort of variety of pens, pencils, paints, colours and so forth. And again, finding the convenience, if I had to go elsewhere, of having this thing rather than carrying a drawing table, which would be a slightly raised thing, a scanner, ink in a bottle with 5 plastic bags so that it wouldn't leak, because ink always wants to find its way out of the bottle whether you want it to or not. Carrying the nib pen, but in such a way that you don't suddenly scratch it on something and wreck the nib, all this sort of stuff. Suddenly to be able to just take an iPad and the Apple Pencil and do this stuff off-site and send it via my phone's Wi-Fi and all the rest of it, it just made it really easier. And then a couple of other things too, doing backdrops for a theatre production where they wanted to be able to have the drawing come to life behind the action on the play. And the iPad has this facility with Procreate that you do your drawing, and you can press a little thing that says video replay, and then you can see this drawing go just like, those beautiful old animations that they used to have, with the, I think it was the Christian message or something like that on TV when I was a child, where you'd see these drawings come to being and it would seem like magic. So anyway, and I just, through doing that, I crossed the Rubicon, and I also found the comfort of using the Apple Pencil on the glass, such that I feel that I can use my, it's my style, but it's also, my line work, but it's also actually, it freed me from my style in some ways too, because I felt like I was limited by what I could do with pen and paper and watercolour and stuff. Also, being on an urgent deadline, and then you have a stuff up where you have to change the words, or you have a big ink blot, or you do something that you didn't want to do, or the person looks badly drawn or whatever. The iPad is so forgiving. You can turn back time. I haven't managed to turn back time sufficiently to take us back to before David Bowie died and we're all happy. But apart from that, it's very forgiving and very flexible, and it makes my job easier and faster and more satisfying.
Actually, I've seen a cartoon from you this year, Cathy, that it looks like you've actually photoshopped in some photographs of people as well. I'm sure I saw Gina Reinhardt and Scott Morrison in a kind of Madonna scene. So I guess like the way you said, you're finding new ways to cartoon, basically, and new methods. So you spoke very briefly about how quickly you have to actually come up with a cartoon. Do you have about a day, is that right, if you're creating cartoons for newspapers, to create a new cartoon for the next day or that day?
For me, I do 4 days a week, and I usually work on that cartoon for each cartoon for the following day with a 5 p.m. deadline. So how I organise my day in the lead up to that 5 p.m. is anyone's. It's like I could fritter it away. I could go and watch a movie if I really wanted to. I probably won't, but occasionally. The main thing is that I've got those few hours to consider what I want to draw and work out if my idea holds up, and I'm pretty comfortable. I'm pretty happy if I've got the idea sorted out by 4 o'clock, and I have a good hour to draw it between 4 and 5 to meet the 5 p.m. deadline. Mm-hmm. And the very best is if I have if I have an idea in the morning, or if I have an idea the day before, which can sort of sit there and like percolate away, and I can come back to it and sort of see where I can take it. Otherwise, it can also be oh my gosh, it's 5 to 5 and I still have nothing, and I'm looking back over my sketchbook and hoping that something is there that gives me that reminds me that I had half an idea that I didn't use and that I could possibly use today. That happens, like it seems to be like weeks on, weeks off. Sometimes I can really struggle for a whole week, and then other times I can have an abundance of ideas. So, but the deadline is everything. So I think I once had a job briefly between cartooning jobs where I was needing to do teaching a group at a graphics college, teaching a class there, and I got ticked off by the boss there for being 10 minutes late. I was meant to be there at 9 o'clock and I was sort of 10 minutes late, and it just struck me that in no other aspect of my professional life is arriving at the time ever important. It's getting there by the deadline that is the important thing. I mean, the deadlines are a little bit flexible, and I can sometimes call in and say, "Help! I'm having a crisis. Please allow a bit of time." But for the most part, it's just focus on the deadline and use your time before that as you can. Try and read the whole internet each day. That helps. Yep. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you had an idea at the beginning of the day, you still have to read the whole internet just to make sure that was the best idea you could have, because you wouldn't want to have missed something. That's right. Okay, I'll shut up.
I've been in a position where, like Cathy, when I was there's a newsletter put out, it was by ACM, Australian Community Media, called The Echidna, that has a cartoon and a article every day, and I started working on that. They put that in the build-up to the last election, and for that I was working 5 days a week, and that was the same kind of thing where I had 4:30 deadline and I had all day to think about it, and that was really nice. And also, like Cathy said, you can sit on things and you can let them percolate. With The Guardian, it's different. It's same-day publication. So so like this morning,
you don't get to sleep on it.
No, and it is a bit like, so like today was a normal, so 3 days a week for The Guardian. I start work at about 6:30, and I just, like, sometimes I'll know my topic the day before, but quite often news changes, and it's sort of, so I have to check in with my editors at 8 o'clock with what the topic is going to be. So I get up and I just listen to all the, like, I have Radio National on, I'm looking through all the papers and things like that, just going, what is, or is there going to be, like, on interest rate day or something like that? You kind of think, okay, well, this is going to be the story of today. So anyway, so I check in with a topic at 8 o'clock. I've got to have a rough or roughs by 10. It's really tight deadline, but I kind of love that. Like, when they told me this is the rules, can you do it? And I was like, yeah, sure. But I like adrenaline. I like it, but because I don't have the time then for the deadline for rough or roughs to let things sit. So quite often I'll think of a few. Like, I go for a walk. I go for a walk around the block, and I sort of just go into this zone, and my brain is like. And
dogs are good for that.
No, my dog's terrible. She wants to wander off. I can't take her with me. I have to go by myself. But yeah, so sometimes, like, I'll just have a few ideas, and I don't have the time to sit and go, is this a crap idea or is this not? I can't. So I'll just go, here's brain fart, a few ideas, or sometimes I just have one idea and I think, nah, that's it. That's the one. And then I only send one. And then, and then sometimes they've got to be legal. The Guardian is super cautious about any sort of legal stuff. Yeah, and then I've got to have it finished by 1. So it's all a bit crazy, but it's fun and it's an adrenaline rush. And and it is like, even though that's online, I have a little saying for myself when there's something that I'm not that happy with. I think tomorrow's fish wrapper, so I go back to the old newspaper thing, and that's my little making myself feel better. If I go, shoot, that didn't, because sometimes I look at it and go, I should have worded that differently, or I should have just drawn that picture differently, and then, but. So that's the curse of
that nobody was going to look at the newspaper.
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. So it's not actually technically correct, is it, tomorrow's tip wrapper, because it's still going to be there online. But that's just what I tell myself when I'm thinking, oh damn it. Anyway. Yeah.
What about you, Jess? Where do you draw your inspiration from for your cartoons? Or how do
Yeah,
you
I think
find inspiration?
I don't have the daily deadline. I'm just putting it up on social media. And so I guess I get to choose a bit more when I have a big feeling about something. And for me, it's very much channeling. I almost use cartooning as therapy sometimes because I'm like, oh, that thing happened, or oh my gosh, that thing happened. And then I have an idea about a cartoon. And as I said before, which is, I think, typical, of a lot of millennial cartoonists, we don't do this as a full-time job. So we have our other jobs, and I'll notice something happening during the day, and then I'll think, okay, that's the thing. Like, for example, Dutton's nuclear brain fart, if we can call it that, a couple of weeks ago, I could just see all the cartoonists like rubbing their hands going, oh, this is going to be great. And so that happened, and then I thought, okay, after work I'm going to draw this. And then so it's sort of like clock off, do a drawing, put it up at 6 p.m. online. This is all kind of like free work that we're doing, and we're only really doing it, I think, for the love of cartooning, for the love of wanting to say something and be part of the political debate, but also because, sometimes that's how you get commissions or get noticed and get your work out there, is that you have to put your work up and keep that churn going. And so I put it up after work usually, and then I'll be responding to comments. It's not a very healthy, sustainable way to work, I'm realising. So I am trying to sort of cut down and just do a little bit less like in the churn. But luckily my other job is in the media cycle. So I'm in the news, I'm kind of like watching what's happening. And so I know the kind of biggest stories of the day. And so I'm just like, while I'm doing that job, I'm kind of like mentally checking what would make a good cartoon and kind of thinking about ideas for that. So, yeah, that's kind of how I work. And
it's interesting that you actually, part of your work is actually responding to comments about your work. And I guess that might be an aspect of this sort of online political cartooning that I'm guessing isn't really part of your work, Fiona and Cathy, or am I wrong there?
Well, there's comments under the Guardian ones, but I'm like, and also you just don't. The only time I've ever responded to someone, I read through, and it's just sometimes nice to see. I mean, very rarely do they actually comment on the cartoon, whether it's good or bad. It's usually a riff on the topic. But once during the budget last year, I had a Jim Chalmers, he was delivering the budget, and there was a scene with instead of Jim's mowers, it was Jim's budget as part of the thing. And there was a comment from an English person underneath saying, I cannot believe The Guardian published this disgusting cartoon making light of Jimmy Savile's abuse, blah, blah, blah. And it went on and on. It was just like, who is this disgusting cartoonist? Who does she think she is? And then someone else had written, mate, this is an Australian cartoon about the Australian budget. It said, the guy went, you cannot tell me she was not joking about the Jim'll Fix It TV show, and that this is, look at the obvious references. And he connected dots that just weren't there, and thought I was making light of a pedophile. And that was the only time I've got in. I've just said, I'm sorry, I'm Australian. I kind of know who Jimmy Savile is because you kind of, but I didn't know he did a show called Jim'll Fix It. This doesn't say Jim'll Fix It. There is no reference to this at all. This is about the Australian budget. But I just thought, I think I'd also just being accused, like this guy just went on and on and on about what a disgusting human being I was, and that there's just no excuse for making fun of pedophilia. And it's like, oh, okay, that's the only time I've commented. And then, but yeah.
Yeah, I remember another story from you, Fiona, about because your cartoons are written for The Guardian or drawn for The Guardian, you do have them published online for the English Guardian as well as the Australian Guardian. You told me about
on Saturday, because I've got the Saturday spot, and they said if you do a broader one, it can go on the international thing. So I just thought, well, if you're going to give me the so I mean broader as in like there are issues that, and it's pretty. Also horrifying how like a cartoon about people living in tents is just as relevant to English people as it is to Australians. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap with the topics. Yeah, well, I think it was your cartoon that's about I now call myself an affordable housing salesman, no longer a tent, camping goods seller. That's up in behind the lines in this. Behind the lines, and then English person commented that he was actually doing that. Yeah, there was under it because there's a cartoon. I think it's up there, and there's a camping goods shop, and a guy, the guy is saying, I used to call myself a camping goods assistant or something, and now I'm affordable housing consultant. And anyway, sorry, I've just killed the cartoon by trying to explain it. But anyway, but yeah, and there was a comment underneath with a guy saying, I can't believe I'm looking at this cartoon. I just went out and bought a tent. I have a job. I just got evicted from my house. I can't afford the rent anymore. And I'm actually going to go and live in a park now. And I'm just thinking, how did this happen? And I just am looking at this cartoon and going, wow, this is actually my life. And it was just like reading that comment and going, oh, God. And that's happening a little bit more. Like when I do homeless ones, there's comments from people, like there's a guy who regularly comments on the cartoons every time I do them and I didn't know anything about him. And then when there's a housing one, he's homeless and he lives in a swag in someone's shed. And like he always comments on stuff he didn't know, and then on the housing one he goes, oh, yeah, and it's tough I've been homeless for 3 years now and blah, blah. And it's like, oh, wow. So, yeah.
Have you ever had surprising reactions to any of your cartoons, Cathy, things that are particularly memorable?
Yes. The first sort of lesson encounter. I had a few lessons. I mean, it's often lessons that you have when people respond in a way that you didn't anticipate. So probably the very first one was making a joke when I was doing just gag cartoons with Stay in Touch or elsewhere, and making a joke about a schizophrenic killing themselves in self-defence, and receiving a letter from a person who was from a schizophrenia awareness organisation explaining so very kindly and patiently how I had not helped the general cause of understanding mental health by perpetuating a misconception about schizophrenia. And I had no idea. I just had no idea, and I felt deeply, deeply ashamed and sort of thought, wow, okay. First lesson in having to really reflect on things. Another interesting lesson was a cartoon that was a gag about golf and Greg Norman or something like that, and it was a slow news day, and I had been filling in for Alan Moyer on the editorial in the editorial cartoon space, which was not my normal space. It was already big and intimidating to have to comment on big stuff and not just do the funny little pocket cartoons and stuff. But I'd taken on a couple of big topics over that week, and then I finally kind of went, oh, golf, Greg Norman's tanked again in the golf. I'll have a go at that. And I got this letter from a person who was so offended by me, taking down our hero golfer, and he was going to cancel his subscription, and this was so bad, and And I had a funny reaction to it, was saying, well, I'm sorry that you're offended, but, this is actually a really hard job. You should try. It was kind of pathetic, but anyway, I sent this thing back saying, here I was thinking I was doing something safe after touching these really scary big topics, and who knew? And then he writes back to me and says, oh, I'm so sorry. I really love your cartoons. I just had a really bad day, and I'd received the 27th refusal for a manuscript that I'd submitted to publishers or something like that, and I just had to let it go, put it out there sometime. And so there was the lesson that when people come at you, it's not always about you. It's so often about them, and that I'm really glad to have had that lesson before the advent of social media, because that you learn that lesson 10 times a week.
Although golf people, I did a cartoon for The Guardian last year or this year sometime, and there was a scene where there was some sort of wealth, I can't even remember what it was about, but there was some sort of wealthy older people who were chatting about stuff, and I drew them on a golf course, and so I Google image stuff. Man, the comments underneath about how the cartoonist obviously doesn't know anything about golf. The point wasn't golf, it was just a scenario. I'd used the wrong golf thing, the wrong golf club.
Oh my God, they're using a putter when it's on the fairway.
People weren't golfers. I'm sure it's the golf thing. It just triggers something off. But they were enraged. And it's like, dude, that's not... Okay, can you give me a bit of licence here? That has nothing to do with the cartoon at all. It's not a cartoon about golf. But people were furious, so, yeah.
Amazing. And back to you having to deal with the comment sections for each of your cartoons, Jess. What kind of comments do you have to field sometimes?
Many varied. Just on that, I drew a surfboard upside down once, and God, do I know which way a surfboard goes now? Like, whoops. I spent a lot of time responding to comments. It's actually part of, if you're on social media and you've kind of got a following and people have a bit of a parasocial relationship with you and they want to share things. And I really love that. I hope I never really lose that, actually. It's so wonderful. It's almost like building a community through cartoons, like especially during the bushfires when I was cartooning on that, and I felt so desperately horrified at looking at the destruction and the animals that were being killed. And then I realised there was a whole lot of people online and out there in the community also. We were all feeling the same thing, and we connected through the cartoons that I was doing. I really, really valued that. But Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. There's so many more platforms
Create
now.
once, publish many times.
Yeah, but one, I do get, sometimes you get trolled, like it is a thing that happens, and I'm a bit weird. I like being trolled because I think it's, maybe because I'm early on in my career, I'm like, oh, people are noticing my cartoons, how exciting. I did one about Alan Jones, and man, if you want to get trolled, do one about Alan Jones, I think.
Too bad they wouldn't run mine.
Oh, really? Well, it was a pretty lazy cartoon, actually. It was when he stepped down from 2GB, and I said, how shall we remember Alan Jones? Let's remember him in his own words. And then I just compiled, the worst quotes that he'd said on record to thousands of people on the radio about women leaders. And man, did I get trolled for that for weeks. But one guy, he just kept messaging me, but he was actually a really nice guy, and he'd be like, I abhor everything you stand for, but you draw really nice pictures. And every time he contacted me, he'd be like, but you've drawn this really well, but it's terrible what you're doing. And it's so, yeah, occasionally you get some interesting interactions.
Yeah, I guess you're really putting yourself out there when you are a political cartoonist and you're having your things published. So it's a bit dangerous, I suppose, or it's quite courageous, actually. Do you have any favourites, or can you think of a favourite cartoon, each of you, that you've produced recently?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Look, it's not recent, but I think it's going to be forever my favourite cartoon. It was during the bushfires again, I drew... Does people know the This Is Fine meme? Oh my gosh. Okay, a couple of people know. Anyway, don't worry, it's not important. But basically I drew Scott Morrison in a room full of flames, and he's holding up a lump of coal, and it says, and he's saying, this is fine, because of course that's essentially what he was doing. And this was one of the first cartoons I kind of had done when I came back to cartooning after being a lawyer and other things. And I put it up on the internet. I did it in literally 2 minutes flat. It doesn't look very good. I put it on Twitter, and it went totally viral. And I was not expecting that at all, but it obviously was at the right time, and other people were feeling it, and it spoke to them as well. And then I got a call from my friend in the UK, and he said, your cartoon has just been on the BBC. Did you know that? And I was like, no. Are you serious? And if he hadn't been watching the TV, I wouldn't have known. But it had obviously... That was the kind of the moment, I think, that I thought, oh, maybe I can actually do this. This is quite exciting. So I think that is always going to be my favourite cartoon. It's been in my bio forever, featured on the BBC. Not really featured, but
Mentioned, yeah.
Mentioned.
We were given this question before, so I had a little look through over the last couple of years of cartoons, and see, it's hard to explain. This is just going to fall flat because you can't explain the cartoon without the pictures. But
this is the room without the screen and the projection.
But a big topic of the last year was robo-debt, and one thing that is when you're doing cartoons about something and you can get to characterise it. So I had a series of cartoons with the robo-debt robot who went through some crises because I felt really bad about what he'd done. Anyway, and I sort of gave this cartoon that I when it was all coming to a head, all the robo-debt thing, and I said I can't remember the exact wording, it was something like the robo-debt robot finally speaks, and it's like the robo-debt robot's sitting at a Channel 7 kind of current affair things, and there's a blonde journalist leaning in and listening to him, and he's saying something like, it was a chance encounter with Scott Morrison's empathy coach that made me finally realise what I was doing was wrong. And I think I just enjoy that because fucking empathy coach, man. I mean, I think, sorry for swearing, but can we just go back to that? there is something called an empathy coach, which is just mind-blowing anyway. No one who is involved in politics at all who needs an empathy coach should be allowed to be anywhere near politics. In fact, you should be, if you need an empathy coach, you should probably just have a job where you never talk to anyone ever, because that is insane. And it was just the fact that everyone went, oh yeah, Scott Morrison, he's been using taxpayer funding for an empathy coach. It's like doing. So it was fun, even though Scott Morrison had been gone for a while, to sort of pull back the empathy coach thing, because I will still never get over the fact that there is an empathy coach and that we had a Prime Minister who needed one. Yeah.
Any favourites from you and Cathy that you can think of?
A favourite of a year and a half ago, I think it was, when two incidents happened in the United States that to me spoke very much of the character of the United States, and I was able to bring those two things together. And one was, there was yet another shooting, I think in Tennessee or something, in a school, and a number of children and adults were killed, and then at a very short time afterwards, then there was news of a school principal who had to step down or be sacked because she had allowed 12-year-old kids at the school to be taught a lesson where they were shown a picture of Michelangelo's David. And the parents were upset because that was pornography. And so I drew the classroom scene with the people dead on the floor and, blood around the place. And a mother is going to get her child, and she's hurrying the child out of the school classroom. And there's a big poster on the wall of David. And the little girl's looking around at this poster, and the mother is telling the child, "Look away, Becky." And that, you could say, went viral, as the language has it. It reached far. It attracted the disapproval of some gun-loving folks on the other side of the world. But it also was noticed by a few people who are involved in, one guy who's an anthropologist in the States, who I'm actually invited early next year to go and talk to his students, his university students, along with I've persuaded him to invite my friend Rebecca Peters, who was very involved. She was the head of the Coalition for Gun Control in Australia when Port Arthur happened, and so she was very much operative in helping get those laws changed. So I said, she comes with the facts. I've got the vibe and the cartoon, but you can have somebody who actually knows what they're talking about in that. And also psychologists who deal with people who are victims of trauma. They sort of said, "Oh, we found this really interesting," and especially we found it interesting that it came from outside of America, because it almost felt like something that people within America would not produce.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Something that struck me when each of you were describing a favourite cartoon was how important the words and the language are to the cartoon's message, the kind of punch of the cartoon. How much time do you spend thinking about language and the wording that you're using when you're creating your cartoons? Maybe we'll start with you, Cathy, if that's okay.
Well, as previously mentioned, I kind of came into the job with a love of language as much as of drawing, and loving what language can do, and the language of cartoons, and kind of, I guess I got all my puns out in the first few years of doing the job. I still succumb occasionally, but loving what language can carry. And a lot of my ideas start with the words anyway. They're often, because working with politics, for example, or people who are in power and stuff like that, so much of politics is about this carefully crafted language that is as much to reveal as to conceal what is happening, what's being done, what's the intention, and so forth. And if you misunderstand it as a mug punter, well, that was your fault for not understanding it properly, because that's certainly not what we meant to say or whatever. So, and a lot of the people employed in politics are there for the purposes of spin. They're there to communicate. They're there to get the message. They're there to craft the narrative and all that sort of thing. So that aspect of language is pretty interesting to me, because I think the cartoonists then have the job of unpicking all that fine craft work of the comms directors and the spin doctors and all the rest of it. I think we're there to kind of just pull at that little thread and go, you know what's behind that? You know what they're trying to say, or what they're trying not to say in this. So often the words come first, often the utterances of the politicians themselves, the sorts of, the stuff about this is coal, this is fine, all that sort of thing. You can often take those utterances of the, I don't hold a hose. Scott Morrison with his I don't hold a hose. I must have done, 20 cartoons where I was able to, turn that one back on him. Because it was reprehensible, and it covered up for a multitude of evils. So that's the fun stuff with language. But I just did 2 cartoons yesterday and for tomorrow, or today and for tomorrow, that don't have any words in them. So it is
Not
possible.
always,
it is
yeah.
possible.
Wow, that's like a once a year or once every couple of years.
The one today, I didn't really know what I was saying either. So there was that. But for tomorrow.
Yeah, for words are for me, and I'm so always start with the words, and then I, draw the picture around it. But like part of the process of doing a cartoon too, when I've got my topic, and it's got to be something I feel something about, know something, have enough knowledge to be able to have an educated thing on it. But I'll sort of think of all the keywords or the words that are going around the issue and sort of spin them around in my head, and sometimes something catches there. But I think also then once you've got the idea, just refining the words, it's almost like writing poetry in a way. You want each word to have the right weight and to have the right rhythm as well. Like sometimes for a gag, I think I read it out loud in my head and you go, well, just the pattern, the rhythm of the language works better written just slightly differently. So yeah, the words is you're just refining it, and also you're working it with the visuals as well. So if there are words that have a double meaning, like it's the beauty of English is that there's so many words and so many nuances in things. So you just want to get that exact right word in there. So yeah, the words, that I pay a lot of attention to the words.
Yeah, I agree. I think the words are the most important bit. And 3 years at Sydney Uni Law School has given me a really healthy paranoia about getting words wrong or saying things that you didn't intend to say through clumsy language or, those sort of things. So, yeah, refining the words is key. And actually, I think I'm continually astonished at how forgiving people, at least on social media, are for bad drawing, because I'm doing things in my own time very quickly, and sometimes I really push it and I'm like, this looks terrible, but the words are okay, so it can go. And honestly, sometimes they're the ones that go the best. As long as the words are all right and it's timely. I think I once drew Peter Dutton. I couldn't be bothered to draw his face, so I just drew him as an oval with a tie, and I couldn't believe people knew who it was. Like, the people were like, "Oh yeah, that's Peter." I really do think as long as the words are right and the idea is right, sometimes it doesn't matter what it looks like.
And that's one of the great things about cartooning, and how it can be a very it can be a real DIY thing, because you don't have to be a great drawer to be a cartoonist. Like one of the most successful cartoonists in the world, and has been for quite a few years now, is an online cartoonist who has 4 letters that I can... KXD.
XKCD.
Oh, yeah. Who is a sort of science communicator cartoonist. You might have, and he does black and white stick figures, and yet it's the idea and getting that across. And I don't know if any of you know of Ron Tanberg's work, one of our greatest cartoonists ever, and winner of, I think, 2 gold Walkleys as well. And he he was still a good drawer, but he would do black and white line work, really simple stuff, and yet a cartoon, it's the idea and the words. So that's why, like, you can jump into, and I think that was why I was lucky too, because I was a terrible drawer and I'm still not a good drawer, and I could cartooning. I just went, I'm just going to jump into this. I'm not going to keep refining my drawing because the idea is there and it's something. Whereas if I was an illustrator, I couldn't have done it because I'm not a good enough illustrator.
And meanwhile, a really well drawn bad idea is just irredeemable.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, it's so there's degrees and it's so that's why I'm always encouraging of, if there are younger people or whatever, cartooning is something that's really open and it can be however you draw. You can be a beautiful gothic cartoonist like David Rowe with his incredible caricatures and his inky madness, or you can be a stick figure drawer, and if your ideas are good, then they're all still part of the great cartooning continuum, and they're all part of that thing that weird thing that is cartooning, that is different to any other form.
Just to share stick figures, I've been drawing everyone as worms recently. I was a bit sick for a couple of months and I thought it's too much effort to draw people's facial features, so I just drew myself as a worm with long hair, and I drew my partner as a bearded worm, and I drew everyone as a worm, and actually they go as well as if I spent heaps of time and energy drawing people's faces. So yeah.
It's amazing what people can recognise and make links to. I was just thinking about how many cartoons I actually looked at when I was curating Behind the Lines, and it was many. I think it must have been over 1,000. And I noticed that, there are so many male political cartoonists in Australia. Like, we have a really strong field of political cartoonists, and the Museum of Australian Democracy, has this exhibition every year because it's such a key part of our democratic system, our political cartooning. But there are only some women political cartoonists, even though you really punch above your weight and you're really, really prominent in our political cartooning field. Do you think there are any barriers for women entering the field of political cartooning these days, or what was your experience when you were first getting into political cartooning as a woman?
I would say I didn't particularly encounter barriers. I think I came at an incredibly fortunate time, where, for one thing, the newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, as I entered it, there were lots of artists there. There were other women illustrators. There was Jenny Coops. She was my sort of, I guess, reference point to go, oh, there's a woman and she does cartoons and I love her. I love her line work and she's funny and she has good gags and all the rest of it. And I knew the French cartoonist Claire Bretéché, and I knew that it was something that was perfectly possible. And I was and I kind of came in with my work and presented my work, and that was that. I don't think it's. I think the difficulty now, because before that it might have been more difficult. It might have been, I don't know if a woman could do that. I mean, I must say, probably in the last 10 years, I remember being at a function of people who were around my age, so they were 50-ish, and encountering somebody who was a lawyer in a social situation, who didn't know me from anyone and was making chit-chat and hadn't heard of me or whatever, and asked what I did, and I said I draw cartoons. Oh, really? Where would I see them? Oh, well, in the newspaper and blah, 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 in the Herald. And he says, and who thinks up the ideas? And, I've heard that one a few times, and the temptation, I've got to say, is huge to say, well, there's this guy, you see. The poor guy doesn't get any credit. I get to write my name on the cartoon and everything. And, and this guy's just sitting in this dark office, doesn't have a window. It's so sad, So, that idea just that it could how is it possible that a woman is doing this? That's the weirdest thing. And also, and I haven't had one for a long time, the dear Mr. Wilcox, I was very unhappy about that cartoon you did about blah, 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 our boys on the front sort of thing. It was, they were invariably on a military theme, that they would be displeased because I hadn't respected the soldiers enough. But I think I've been at a really lucky time when, as I was saying, that the doors were kind of open to people if they had the goods. Kaz Cook as well, who had actually a remarkably short career comparatively as just a cartoonist, because she was also a journalist, and then she went, didn't do cartoons after a while. But it was normal enough when I was starting out. It was not so strange. I think since then, the fact that it hasn't changed a whole lot is sort of a result of a bunch of things, and one of those things is the fact that the slice of the size of the pie to be shared is getting smaller and smaller anyway. So, and the cartoonists who are there, they get their jobs and they don't leave their jobs if they possibly can avoid it, and they stay there and they hang on to their stool until they die. And so there's not a great tendency to pass the baton, to hand it over, and fewer jobs. So we're spread much more thinly. So I mean, without if you were to compare it with as I would compare an analogous kind of job, it would be, say, as a stand-up comedian. There are many more women comedians coming through because they actually define their own workplace, their own industry. There's an infinite number of places for comedians, women and men and anything else. But there's only so many published paid jobs for cartoonists. So apart from the young folk like Jess and like others of that of your era who are actually carving out your space online and through social media, but you don't count on making a living out of it, not unless you do merchandise. So I think all of those things play into the fact that there are fewer and fewer jobs for cartoonists, and therefore fewer and fewer possibilities for women in that.
I've had a slight I came into cartooning as it was sort of drying up, so there wasn't as much work, but I definitely found that it would depend on the art director of the paper. Like there was the Herald, Fairfax were generally much more open, but so yeah, this was like 1999 or something, and I went for contacted another major newspaper and was told by the art director, come in and show us your portfolio, come in at midday. I thought, that's a bit of an odd time, but oh well, and I was a little, keen bean, new to the thing. Got into the office and the guy said, oh, is that the time? It's lunchtime, let's go out to lunch. And I went, oh, okay, I guess, I don't know. Went out to lunch, he bought tons of wine. I sat there for 2 hours listening to him sipping one glass of wine while he downed his bottle of wine and wanked on and on about what a legend he was, didn't ask me anything about cartooning, anything at all. After 2 hours, we went back to his office and, he made me pay as well, and I had no money. It was like, wow, I've just paid $25 for a pub lunch I didn't know I was having. And then I went back to his office, and obviously I hadn't been given him the right positive response or whatever. And he sat down and he said, before I look at your folio, I should just tell you we've got no work. And I said, oh. And then he opened the portfolio and he went flick, 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 and then gave it back to me. And I said, thank you. He was very powerful. He was the person who controlled all of the art, cartoonists and everything in this thing. There were no women at all in this huge art department. I felt about this big. I walked out just feeling like a fool and feeling like whatever it was I was supposed to do, I'm fucking not doing that. Sorry for my swearing again, but yeah, that I still think about, and I never ever went near that huge multi-newspaper publishing.
I story about
unnamed
them.
ever again. And it's still, like, it's weird, like that stuff, it makes you feel really shit. Like, you don't think, you asshole, you think, oh, I was a fool. And, like, it's just that kind of... And, like, this was, many, many years ago, but it was like Australia doesn't have a lot of media organisations, and that was just, like, a whole one that was... I just went, well, I guess I'm never darkening their doorstep again. So, that was... Like, even when I think about it, I feel really stressed. I sort of just, like... It was really humiliating. And, and I had a couple of editors in in magazines and stuff who were a bit, that kind of... Just jerky blokes who wanted to power trip because you're... And I just thought, you would never have done this to a young man. Like, you just wouldn't have done it. And it's a... Anyway, so that was my...
Well, joke's on them, Fiona, because you were, you're now an eminent cartoonist.
Down and call him up and go, 25 years later, asshole, guess what?
Yeah. I should mention that Fiona was MoAD's Political Cartoonist of the Year last year, voted by a judging panel, and well deserved. Do you find yourself being a mentor to young women cartoonists at all, Fiona, these days?
I get... So, because also, like, coming up in cartooning as well, there was Cathy, Judy Horacek, and Jenny Coops. By the time I started cartooning, Jenny Coops wasn't doing so much. But so for a long time, there haven't been a lot of young female cartoonists, and whenever I meet one, I'm so excited. Like, I think I seem like a crazy old lady. Like, I at the Stanley, the Cartoonist Association conference a couple of years ago, and there were some young women there, and when I first met Megan Herbert, fantastic Megan Herbert, you might know her stuff from Nine Papers, formerly known as Fairfax, and she is just brilliant. And when I first met her, I think I grabbed her by the shoulders. I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to see another female cartoonist. And anyway, now she knows I'm a normal person, but I think when I first met her, she was kind of like, okay.
No, you're not.
Shh, I'm putting on a good performance in front of these people.
Jess, do you sometimes get in touch with other young women cartoonists, or do you have like a little group that you know of, support group? Yeah.
Well, just firstly to say I'm so grateful for Fiona and Cathy and all the amazing women cartoonists who have kind of made space for younger women cartoonists to come in. We are in contact. We've got like various cartooning groups of millennial or Gen Z cartoonists, but I have to say, like, your question went to, is that being a woman a barrier? And I think Cathy really put the nailed on the head whatever that quote is. I can't remember, but basically I think this is one of the few areas of my work in which gender is not the main issue. It's actually a structural problem or structural issue or barrier in that the art form has been tied to newspapers as a tradition for so long, and now newspapers are kind of like my generation does. I'm an elder millennial, so I can still remember coming to work and the newspapers are there on the table and we'd look at the cartoons, but now that's not the case. And then my mates who are Gen Z, they're like, what's a newspaper? Like, what is that? And so the art form has really changed, and the way we share and do political commentary through cartooning has really changed as well. And it is a real conundrum that we're all grappling with, which is, how do we monetize this? How do we get enough support to be able to keep doing this? Because there'll always be people wanting to do political commentary through cartoons, but it's actually a really heavy, big lift if you're doing it after your full-time job and just for the love of being part of the debate, or because you're a millennial or Gen Z and you have really big things you want to say about the housing market or climate change or social justice issues or racism. Like, it's important that we're part of that narrative, but it's a real question as to how we can be there and continue to be there if they're not full-time jobs in that, and you're right, you do have to merchandise it. Like, I should probably do fridge magnets or, I don't know, mugs or, there's different ways, but it's what you can carve out now, and it's up to each individual artist to work that out. And there's not a format or a template that works necessarily for everyone. And just wrestle the mic off me. If I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, in the last year, there's so many social media platforms now that you can be on, and in a way that really allows people to be part of the debate and do their cartoons and put them up and share them. But it also means, like, where do you build your following, you know? Elon Musk took over Twitter. We now have Blue Sky, Mastodon, TikTok, Instagram, Substack. Like, there's all of these platforms now. And it's a bit mind-boggling. Like, you don't know where you should be or where you should build that following or how you can craft, you know, a following that will pay you or subscribe to your work so that you can continue to do it. So that's the biggest barrier, I think. I think it'll be interesting to see what this exhibition is in 20 years' time and where those cartoons are coming from, because I currently don't know where they'll be.
That's a really interesting note to end on. Thanks, Jess. Thinking about political cartooning possibly sort of transitioning in the future and becoming something that is unfolding at the moment. Thank you, all three of you, for coming on to the panel tonight. I've enjoyed the discussion. I hope everyone here has.
Thank you so much, Fiona and Cathy and Jess. And thank you very much, Alex, too. That was fantastic. That was so good. Sorry about that. And I just want to say that it was Alex's idea to have an all-female panel, including herself. And then we added Julie, and we had all women. So I think that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. So the Fountain Court exhibition will be open for another half an hour if you want to check out all of the cartoons they've just been talking about. And I can also let you know that we have another event next Tuesday night. If you're interested in what the difference between unicameralism and bicameralism Parliament, those of you who really enjoyed our chamber tour, please join us next Tuesday night. And you'll find that on Eventbrite if you want to look it up, or on the Parliament's website. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Really great.